You're welcome to this special edition of the Economy and Politics Show, where we highlight key developments as analyzed by Proshare Research through the Analyst note. I'm Ottoabasi Abasiekong. Recently, Proshare published an Analyst note that looked at revisiting Nigeria's public-private partnership approach, the monopoly question, and investments. Our conversation today will be on revisiting Nigeria's public-private partnership model. How is it going so far, and what can be done to make it more efficient for economy? With me to have this conversation in the studio is Ademidun Shogo, corporate analyst with Proshare, and Tosin Ige, head of research Proshare.
Thank you.
Proshare has brought out this analyst note. We've talked much about public-private partnership. You hear public sector leaders, you hear the private sector leaders talking about the need for a PPP that is effective. But so tell us why this particular analyst note at this time is critical. What is it about public-private partnership in Nigeria that needs to be addressed?
Okay, thank you very much again for having us. And the issue for today is quite peculiar, and I think the issue itself is coming on board because of the recent between the Dangote refinery and, of course, the regulator. But it's been one of our arguments at the last NES, that's the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, that we really need to revisit the approach to the PPP, which is the public-private partnership agreement. Now, PPP by itself actually thrives on the balance of interest between the public and the private. When we look globally at this period, it's unlikely for us to see a truly or perfectly capitalist economy, and at the same time, or on the other hand, the socialist system. So there's always a balance between the two, and that is why this is coming on board and say, let's create a balance between the private sector and the public sector. When you look at different countries, in South Korea, we see the way they are supporting their businesses. We've seen the likes of LG coming from
LG
there.
Electronics,
exactly.
Samsung. Yeah.
Yes, and when we see, again, when you look at the German economy too, we see their automobile, the way they are
BMW cars.
Exactly, the
Mercedes-Benz,
Volkswagen, the Mercedes-Benz. So what we are also now looking at is that let's also bring all of this home. We can't, because of the way our politics is run, we can't leave everything to the government, because more often than not, politics tend to trump economics. So, and at the same time, we can't leave everything to the private sector. We may be subjected to price gouging or customer exploitation there. So let us create a balance in our public-private partnership model. But the challenge you will find out with our kind of PPP model has been that there's always a divergence of interest between the two. So while the government is setting its own up and saying, okay, this is the model we have, this is how we want businesses to run, more often than not, it doesn't align with what the private sector has as a business. Don't forget, the private sector are in business for business, to make money. So, and thus, we need to create a balance. If the government is being, let's say, socialist or pursuing the interest of the people, you also need to also consider the business, because don't forget, as I said, these people are in business to make money. So we need to create a balance between the two. So that non-alignment in terms of the interest has always been one of the key things. I don't want to go into the example of the Dangote. You see what is coming on board along that line. Another point we see is that, again, when we come to the policy formulation as well as the execution, there's also non-alignment in that, because you see government coming up with different plans, the National Development Plan, the rolling plan, even the national budget, and you find it very difficult for you to establish when the execution, what they are actually the program. You know, Proshare has always been the policy plan and project. So when it gets to the project stage, it often contradicts what we plan as a people, as a nation. So there's always that non-alignment that possibly, in most instances, more often than not, it doesn't even factor in the private sector. Because I remember, whether it is the National Development Plan or one of their plans, so that they said they will give greater role to the private sector. Yes. But again, when it comes to the execution stage, you just see budgets, allocation flying around, and you do not actually see the private sector component in all of this. So that tends to create an issue also. And I think lastly, on the challenge of our PPP model, one thing we've also realized is that the public-private sector model doesn't give room for, or let me say give room for, but we fail to use it, which is the incorporation of it. Now, I said the non-incorporation of our PPP model. Now, I'll bring it home to the issue of the NLNG. Now, when you see the NLNG, you know
seems
that
to be a success story.
It's a success story because it is incorporated. So when it is incorporated, for a PPP that is incorporated, what happens is that you actually reduce the political influence. Now, for our NLNG now, government cannot wake up one day and say, this should be the MD, this should be the MD, or allocation should go this way. No. So when we incorporate our joint venture, what will happen is that it gives room for the experts, for those who own the business, who understand the business, to actually direct this operation
and take more decisions that impact the business.
And I think that's one of the problems we're having with NNPC.
Nigerian National Petroleum Company, yeah.
Exactly. It's one of the problems. So if many of the joint venture are actually incorporated, we won't be having the problem we're having, because the political influence of it will be totally reduced. And so those who understand the business can actually direct the affairs of that model. So I think that's one of the problems with our PPP, and that's why we're coming up with this report at this time.
Wow. I mean, a major thing you've said there is the incorporation of our joint ventures. It's very huge. And we know the impact that will have on an NNPC, and hope to see that pushed up as advocacy and being a response from government too, because we really need a lot of investments in the economy. So let me come to you, Ade. I mean, as kids, we used to see what happened with the automobile industries and textile. They were the drivers of the economy. When you look at the north, like Kano and Kaduna, Kaduna had automobile industries like Pujo, Assembly, and then of course, Kano had the textile flourishing. We had whole economy, jobs created and all that. But we have seen that due to several factors, inability to achieve the import substitution, high costs, macroeconomic headwinds and all that, we have seen that industry completely erode in terms of its value and essence. I know in the automobile, we've seen some plans, we've seen some domestic auto companies trying to do their best, like the Northsons, the North and all that, but there's still challenges. Could you just shed more light on this whole issue? Because this is a very critical aspect of what PPP, again, can achieve.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me again. I think you've actually described the challenges. You described what has happened to the sector. So, like you said, the automobile assembly, we saw that how the sector came from booming to pieces within just how many years. And that's because we also saw that the textile industry too, from having almost full capacity, reducing to probably a junk. Now we are highly dependent on the imports to actually take care of our welfare, of our shelters and all those things. It just speaks to something. It speaks to, we have the challenges about policies. So we have, if you look at the Nigerian model, it suggests that the frequency of policy adjustment sometimes lead to affect the sectors so much. So for instance, now when it comes to the automobile, we saw that there was a structural adjustment program, that actually encouraged imports. And the imported goods were quite cheaper. And for the fact that we have the household had disposable income that were lower than before, they could easily go for the Tokumo. That was the name used for it at that time. It was so easy for them to purchase that relative to the assembled one in Nigeria, was quite expensive. So those are some of the policies. So what I've been able to observe so far, that as we change administration, there's always an adjustment of policies that negate the previous ones. So inconsistency. So the inconsistency tends to affect some sectors. So it's not only limited to the automobile sector alone and also the textile sector. We've seen other policies to affect other sectors, showing that there's so many challenges. Then apart from that, there's the challenge about political interest too. So be an economy in which there's a lot of vested interest
Mm.
in some sectors. We have Nigeria has become an economy that is highly important. We like to import our taste preference, our chains. Yes,
so
we are
high.
so import dependent. There's some policies that do not encourage entrepreneurs to actually start up their own and encourage them. For instance, let me give an example of the automobile now. We have companies, domestic companies that actually assemble this product. Even the government doesn't patronize them. So there's been a clamor for government to use
the recent incidents with National Assembly.
Exactly.
Just low-hanging fruits. Use the Innocent cars or not. Just get them and then don't import. But they still had to go and import cars.
Because before the structural adjustment program, it was compulsory for everybody to use locally assembled cars.
Like Peugeot
and all those. So that was the rainy cars. And it was good for our economy. We had less pressure on FX than the way we have currently. So those are some of the factors that we know. We have the policy issue, the vested interest. We have the fact that different adjustment to policies. Then also we can talk about the economic environment too. So we've seen costs rise so much.
Production.
It can be it's a very heavy weight on companies.
The manufacturing sector keeps complaining. Even just over the weekend, they talked about the 35% interest rate. Manufacturers are just like they're choked.
They're choked.
Yeah.
So after that, we'll talk about the infrastructural gap. So Nigeria has a very wild infrastructural gap. We have railways are still not across the networks of the country. That affecting smooth operations. We have electricity is also thing. We know that Nigeria has a very large electricity deficit. So companies complain about the fact that they have to spend a lot in order to substitute for their electricity. There are other so many factors that tend to affect all these companies from actually going to their potential level. So most of the sectors tend to actually perform below their potentials. And those are some of the things that the government has to put in place. There's a need for us to actually close some of the gaps in our infrastructure. Yes, because companies that advance tend to have better infrastructure. So actually, it's a platform. It's like a foundation for the private sector to actually grow.
Definitely. Just like Tosin said, economies like he said, South Korea, like Germany, so they had to even do things to provide that enabler for their own companies and advance them, which we are seeing across the world. So even though it tells into the steel, steel used to be part of the components for the automobile. But because of that, the steel industry just collapsed and all that, glass, companies and all that. So it's a whole lot that needs to be unpacked. And that brings me to this aspect, Tosin, the issue around strategic, important companies, SICs. And Proshare looks at this as very, very critical. I'd just like you to shed more light on these SICs because is it what we see in the West, like the US, UK, or so, where they have these SICs and say, okay, these are drivers. Even China, they've seen some companies flourish, like Huawei, that are now big in terms of tech infrastructure, competing with the US to the point that the US now have to look at tariffs and all that. It's a whole war.
So exactly. So when you look at it from that side, from the way the world is structured now, what's the driving thing? That's the artificial intelligence and the chips, semiconductors are becoming the main thing. That's why we're seeing the likes of the US and China prioritizing this industry, this company, have been strategic to the growth of their country. So basically that concept is also we developed to say the company or industry that are key to your national aspiration. So that's why we call them strategically important companies, or you can stretch it to say industry. Now, these are industry that you believe as a country will fit into your growth targets. Now, if I personally, I think at the last discussion we're looking at, I was asking the issue of the Nigerian dream. So if at this period, an average Nigeria, the young folks like us, we do not know what the Nigerian dream is, let's proxy it with the $1 trillion economy that we're looking at. Now, from the household side, people will be looking at how does the $1 trillion economy benefit me as an household? But for businesses will be looking at what industry is the government looking at to achieve this that I can actually leverage as a business, as an entrepreneur. So we are saying that let us identify those industry. But for us to identify those industry, we need to understand first the Nigerian dream, where we are going as a people. So by the time we identify where we are going, we'll see those industry that will lead us there. Of course, it's not so much that other industry are not important, but we're saying these are the industry that will lead us to where we are going. And so by the time we identify those industry, all our priority, even budget, will reflect all of this industry. And for Proshare research, we're looking at, when we examine the dynamics of our country at this period, we'll see that first, the energy, which of course feed into the refinery, is one of the key sectors. And now let me flip it back to say, because of the scale and the necessity of this sector, sometimes their scale and the cost of entry tend to hedge out rivals. And so that's why naturally some of them are natural monopoly or or oligopolist. So, but you know, when the issue around Dangote being a monopoly came on board, we were like, okay, if you are saying Dangote is a monopoly, what happened to the 4 national refinery that is coming on board? Now, if there is anybody that should be accused of monopoly in terms of the energy sector, I think it should be the NNPC. Because don't forget, they have been the sole importer of this fuel into the country. And so we are having a private sector coming on board to say, okay, there is a need for the country. Let us enter into this industry. So because of the scale and the cost of entry, these are natural oligopoly, because the NNPC is also coming on board. So the question of monopoly is not there.
Yes, and what also has plans. There's even Walter Smith, some other modular refineries.
Ports, all of them. So when you look at it, they are natural oligopolists. Yeah. So, but it's because of the scale and their importance to the system. Again, we looked at the tech infrastructure too. Now, how many businesses are into the tech infrastructure? It's because of the scale and the entry barrier. We naturally, prevent rivalry. Yeah. But if you have the scale, if you have the funding, you can broadband, come into it. We've seen it also play out in the rail industry. Yes. Although our rail industry is still monopolized by the government, but yes, in advanced countries we've seen it being demutualized, where someone owns the rail infrastructure, another person that owns the train itself. So these are ways we can actually look at, but it is not for every business owner because of their size. So that's why we're saying we identify some of this industry and say these are industry that naturally you will expect the natural oligopoly. But it is not for us to demonize them as a business, but for government to set up the structure and the regulation that will ensure that these businesses...
Fair market practice.
Exactly. Fair market prices, they do not engage in price gouging. They do not exploit the consumer. So, and you provide the enabling environment, because if you don't forget, the global economy, I like to look at it as a marketplace. All countries are shopping for investors. So if you are setting your own environment in such a way that is not friendly to investors, they will naturally go into other areas. Africa, the whole of Africa need refined oil. Yeah. If we are demonizing the Dangote refinery, I can assure you that there are several African countries that are beckoning on Dangote.
We've already seen Gabon
exactly. So that's what we need. That's what we call the concept of the systemically important company.
Yeah, in just very few minutes, Nigeria's sustained growth depends on a public-private partnership model that's devoid of self-sabotage. Like Tosin has highlighted some things. Now, we're looking at proper signaling. I mean, from fiscal monitoring in a way that, it shows that we're open for business. Talk us through in a few minutes what needs to be done, because, of course, you analyze also the fixed income and bonds market. You've seen that already our government has gone to shop with the $500 million bond. And the minister is optimistic that we double that. We need investments at this time.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. So on signaling is very important. We've seen countries over the world actually very stringent on their expectation and signaling through their policies. So what are the policies that the government needs to do to suggest that they are ready to actually grow the economy to attract investors? So based on the recent policies they've announced, it suggests that a tightening or maybe a crowding out of the private sector. So that signals automatically to investors that they should just wait. So there's a need for us to make policies that are quite favorable. They're very favorable. There's a need for us to remodel subsidies. So Nigeria has been known to know subsidy as a consumption incentive. So let's remove it to a productive incentive. So companies that are thriving, that they know that they are part of the top 10 companies that are going to drive growth in the next few years should be given subsidies. So subsidies to be directed toward their production. That will help. We are not the only one giving subsidies. We've seen it in the likes of China. We've seen in the US giving to their chips. They have semiconductors, just because they know that in the next 20 years, they want to be like a dominant players. We have giving subsidy makes their products competitive, globally competitive, and it's an advantage for the country. So there's a need for us to remove that. Then another thing we have to do is work on infrastructures. Nigeria is very laid back on infrastructure. There's a lot of gap that needs to be done. And the government has to be ready to partner to private sectors. So like T.I. said, he said something about the fact that railways doesn't necessarily have to be monopolized by government alone. So there's a need for us to call for investors. There's a value chain in railway, a very large value chain that we have global economies are making money from. So there's a value chain in real estate that we can actually tap into and make a lot of. So when we are ready to invest in all these sectors, the foreign investors are seeing it as a positive signal, because you're putting the first foot forward. Definitely they are ready to come into the company. So it has to do with policies. It has to do with we have eagerness. We have we have plan or projects, yes, that can, and the faces, because Nigeria likes to pronounce policies. Nigeria likes to make expectations of what they want to achieve. But what are the plans in place to achieve them? What are the roadmap that will lead us to it? What are the steps? How do we assess ourselves over the years? Then what are the number of years assigned to horizons, assigned to all those projects? I think if we have some form of accountability, we are visible for investors and they want to tap into the economy.
Definitely. Very interesting conversation, but let's wrap up. Your closing thoughts, Tosin.
Okay,
on this whole PPP. It's really interesting.
There are different models of PPP that I think we need to understand and pitch our tent appropriately. Now, if we see that over the years our government-owned enterprises are not so viable as it were, we need to really give greater participation to the private sector, but not to totally. So one of those things we have been advocating is actually equity financing, meaning that it's time to start listing some of our national,
leveraging the capital market.
Our national assets and national companies. Now, when you go to the advanced countries, it's unlikely for you to see any big business that is unlisted. Now, one of those things that thing does is that there is transparency in the system, because all eyes is on the company. Your book must be published. All information must be disclosed. So greater scrutiny is on this, and audit is on the company. If you ask an average Nigerian comment about NNPC, they are likely to give one voice because of the lack of transparency. So a number of these companies, let's bring it into the market. By the time we list them, now you won't even need to be looking for funding for some of your projects. Don't forget, you have a viable company. The dividend, government can own 80% of this company. So meaning that the dividend, 80% of the dividend is still going back to the government. But there is greater efficiency and transparency in the company. If we are not looking at the listing model of it, as I said, the NLNG offers us a model. It has its own challenges, but at least we could see the viability of the NLNG model. So the JV model, but incorporated, is one model we should look at for some of these oil company, not oil company anyway, only the entire government ventures, the GOEs, as it were. So by the time we use this model, we will gain more revenue, or I swear, we will sweat them more in terms of, and the efficiency will be there, the transparency will be there. It will be a win-win situation for both the government and the people.
Very interesting, very interesting. And ideas, government is still shopping for investors. That's what we're seeing now. What are your closing thoughts? Okay,
my closing thought would be that Nigeria is being known to be so fixated on oil sector. So our focus on oil sector has cost us some other sectors. So there's a need for us to rethink that model. So we have global economies, we have advanced economies that do not even have natural resources, and they are doing very, very well. So there's a need for us to look for sectors that are viable. The textile sector is still a sector that can grow. We have there are other sectors that we can focus on. The agricultural sector seems to be lagging behind too, because there are some of the sectors that we need to relook at, do a draft, do a model, do a plan on how to, to revamp them, because we can't keep relying on oil sector. Where there's a shift to clean energy. So as we move farther away from oil, Nigeria is going to just be behind the scene, and we need to be out there in Africa and also globally. So we need to remodel our structure. So move from the oil-based mentality to a new diversified structure.
Very interesting conversation. I must say that so much enlightenment on the public-private partnership that has been mounted over time, but how we can get it to work for the good and shared prosperity of our nation. It was nice having this conversation with you, Ademidun Shogo, corporate analyst, Proshare, and of course, Tosin Ige, head of research, Proshare. Thank you once again for having this robust conversation. That was a conversation on revisiting the public-private partnership model in Nigeria and the way it can work for the country. To our viewers, if you want to get further insight into this analyst note, very rich one, log on to our website displayed on the screen, and also follow our social media platforms for further updates on developments in the economy and our analyst notes that keep you updated with developments in the economy. Till we come your way again, it's been a very interesting conversation on the economy and policy show. I'm Ottoabasi Abasiekong. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.